Humans invented wine almost 2,000 years before they invented writing. That is not a guess, that is chemistry. Long before anyone could spell the word grape, someone had already figured out how to turn its juice into something that could make you forget your own name. And then they buried it in the ground and waited. I'm going to show you how a piece of fruit that wants to rot taught a species that wanted to survive how to get drunk on purpose. You have to understand how strange that is, because the obvious answer is completely wrong. The obvious answer is that wine was an accident, that grapes just sat around, got fizzy, someone tasted it, liked it, and we have been copying that mistake ever since. But that does not explain anything. Grapes rot into vinegar a lot more easily than they turn into wine. Leave grape juice on your counter right now, and you will not get wine. You will get something sour and undrinkable that your fridge will make you throw away. So the real question is not who found fermenting grapes. The real question is, who figured out how to stop them from becoming vinegar? And why did they bother to try more than once? And to answer that, you have to go back much further than you think. Back before kings and before cities and before anyone had an alphabet, to a damp hillside in what is now the country of Georgia, about 8,000 years ago. Picture her. She is kneeling in cool earth next to a clay jar as tall as her waist, a jar she and her family spent weeks building and firing. Her hands are stained purple up to the wrists. Inside the jar is crushed grape juice, skins and stems and all, and it is starting to bubble. Not boil, bubble. Tiny beads rising on their own. She does not have a word for yeast. She does not have a word for fermentation. She does not have a word for alcohol. But she can smell it changing. Something sharp and sweet and alive is happening in that jar, and she knows if she gets it right, her whole village will have something that lasts through the winter. And if she gets it wrong, the whole jar will be wasted, and they will have nothing to show for all that fruit. She leans closer. She listens to it hiss. That hiss is the sound of the entire future changing. And it is coming from a film thinner than your fingernail. On the skin of every single grape is a faint, dusty cloud you can wipe off with your thumb. That cloud is wild yeast, thousands of microscopic organisms waiting for sugar. When a grape is intact, the yeast stays outside and the sugar stays inside, and nothing happens. When the grape is crushed, they meet. The yeast eats the sugar and makes two things, carbon dioxide and ethanol. And that ethanol is wine. A single-celled fungus smaller than the dot over an I decided whether a village would have clean water and celebration and trade, or whether empires would have a reason to talk to each other. And the people in those hills in Georgia figured out how to make that meeting happen on purpose. Archaeologists found it because the jars themselves remembered. In a village called Gadatrili Gora, they dug up shards of enormous egg-shaped clay vessels called Qvevri, and inside the clay, absorbed into the pores, were tartaric acid and malic acid and citric acid in exactly the pattern grapes leave behind. Not just grapes, but grapes that had been deliberately kept with their skins for weeks. And these jars were not little cups, they were 3 feet tall, buried up to their necks in the floor of a house, so the earth could keep them cool. One jar could hold 70 gallons. One jar held enough wine to get an entire Neolithic village drunk for a week, made by people who had not yet invented the wheel. They had no microscopes, no thermometers, no idea what yeast was, but they were doing microbiology anyway. They learned that if you leave the juice on the skins, you get the red color and the tannins that keep it from spoiling. They learned that if you bury the jar, the temperature stays steady around 55 degrees and the yeast works slow and clean. They learned that if you seal the mouth with clay and cover it with earth, the bad bacteria that turns wine to vinegar cannot get in. They had no word for anaerobic fermentation, but they were doing it anyway, and they pulled it off so well that the same kind of jar is still being made in Georgia right now, by the same method, and wine made in it can still be drunk 8,000 years later. You can still go to Georgia today and find a man whose family has made Qvevri for 5 generations, beating the clay by hand, firing it for a week, burying it in his cellar exactly as his great-great-grandfather did. And when you ask him why he does not just use a steel tank, he will tell you, the clay breathes. And he is right. If you ever get the chance to drink wine from a Qvevri, take it, because you are tasting the oldest human recipe we have ever found that we still follow exactly. But if wine was so clever and so old, why did it take thousands of years for the rest of the world to want it? Because for a long time, almost nobody did. This is the part that makes no sense until you hear it. For centuries, the smartest, most powerful people on the planet thought wine was poison, madness, or a sign you were a barbarian, and they had elaborate reasons to prove it. The Greeks loved wine, but they thought drinking it straight could kill you or drive you insane. Every Greek symposium, every drinking party where philosophers talked, had a man whose only job was to mix the wine with water, sometimes 3 parts water to 1 part wine, sometimes even more. To drink unmixed wine was something only wild men and mythical monsters did. Homer writes about the Cyclops drinking wine neat, and it is meant to show he is not civilized. If you were a respectable Greek man and someone saw you drinking wine the way we drink it today, you would be laughed out of the city as an alcoholic savage. The Romans took it further. In early Rome, wine was so tightly controlled that women were forbidden from drinking it at all. Not discouraged, forbidden. A husband who caught his wife drinking wine could legally punish her, and, in the oldest stories, kill her. Cato the Elder wrote that a woman drinking wine was as bad as adultery. There were legends that women had to kiss their male relatives on the mouth whenever they came home so the men could smell their breath for wine. Imagine that weight. They did what detail? An entire legal tradition where a kiss was a breathalyzer test, and your own husband was the police. And then it got weirder. By the Middle Ages, doctors in Europe looked at wine and saw medicine, but also moral danger. Some medieval texts warned that wine heated the blood and caused leprosy. Not loosened your tongue, gave you leprosy, permanently. Monks debated whether Christ had really turned water into fermented wine at Cana or just into pure unfermented grape juice, because the idea that the Son of God made alcohol made them nervous. In parts of the Islamic world where wine had once flowed freely in poetry and courts, a slow and serious religious and legal crackdown made it increasingly forbidden after the 8th century. Not because people stopped liking it, but because scholars argued it clouded the mind that should be clear for prayer. So you had this absurd situation where one handful of purple juice was simultaneously sacred and sinful, medicine and poison, Greek civilization and barbarian chaos, depending on which side of a river you stood on. And none of that stopped it from spreading, because one obsession needs only one obsessed person to carry it further than any law can reach. Wine should have stayed a local trick of the Caucasus, but it did not. And that is because wine is not just a drink, it is a tool for power, and power always finds a smuggler. Stay with me here, because the next person is the reason you have a bottle of wine on your table tonight. His name was not a king. It was Dom Pierre Perignon. And no, he did not invent champagne the way the cartoon makes you think. The real story is better and more unhinged. Perignon was a Benedictine monk in charge of the cellars at the Abbey of Haute-Villers in France in the late 1600s, and his job was the opposite of what you expect. His job was to stop wine from bubbling. In cold northern France, still wines had a problem. Fermentation would start in the autumn, slow down when the winter got cold, and then restart in the spring when it got warm again, making the wine faintly fizzy in the bottle. Bottles exploded. Cellars were dangerous. Nuns would wear iron masks when they went down to fetch wine. Perignon spent years trying to prevent that second fermentation, blending grapes from different villages, picking earlier, making stronger glass. And he got very good at making calm, still wine. But here's the wait. They did what twist that actually matters. A few valleys over, in England, a scientist named Christopher Merritt had already written down in 1662 exactly how to make wine sparkle on purpose by adding sugar, 30 years before Perignon got famous for trying to stop it. The English were adding sugar to French wine, putting it in coal-fired glass strong enough not to explode, and drinking sparkling champagne while the French monks were still trying to keep the bubbles out. Perignon never invented bubbly at all. What he did was perfect the art of blending so precisely that people could finally make a white wine from black grapes that was so clear and so fine it could become bubbly without being a cloudy mess. He was not the inventor of champagne, he was its obsessive editor, tasting grapes from every hill and remembering them like notes of music. But if you want a truly unhinged obsessive, you want the woman who came after him. Her name was Barbe Nicole Clicquot, widowed at 27 in 1805, running her husband's tiny champagne house in a world at war. Napoleon had blockaded all of Europe. Her cellars were full of unsellable champagne. Her competitors told her to quit, and she did something so audacious, it sounds invented. In 1814, as soon as Napoleon fell and the port opened, she loaded a single ship with 10,000 bottles of champagne and smuggled it through the Russian blockade to St. Petersburg, gambling everything she owned on one shipment. If that ship sank or was seized, she was ruined. It arrived. The Russians, who had been cut off from French luxury for years, went insane for it and bought every bottle at any price. She became the grande dame of champagne, and she also invented the riddling rack, the wooden table with holes that lets you turn a bottle upside down a little every day, so all the dead yeast slides into the neck and can be frozen out, leaving the wine crystal clear. You see that rack in every winery tour today, and do not realize a young widow who refused to sell her business invented it on her kitchen table because she was tired of cloudy wine. A rack of holes and a single gamble on a boat made bubbles respectable. A dusty film on a grape skin made civilization possible. And that is before we talk about what happened when wine became an industry so big it could starve people. Here's the part no one tells you, and it is the one dark passage you need to understand why wine is not just a fun story about monks and bubbles. For most of wine's history, wine was safer than water. That is not romantic, that is literal. Water in a city could carry cholera, dysentery, parasites. Alcohol kills those microbes. So workers drank wine, children drank watered wine. Whole towns drank wine at breakfast because the alternative might kill you in a week. Wine was not luxury, it was sanitation. So when the wine failed, people did not just lose a drink, they lost their clean water. In the summer of 1845, a single-celled mold called powdery mildew, and then a tiny insect called Phylloxera, an aphid smaller than a grain of sand, arrived in Europe on imported American vines. You could not see it at first. Underground on the roots of millions of vines, it fed, and the roots swelled and rotted. Above ground, the leaves yellowed. A vineyard that had lived for 100 years died in a single season. Across France, across Italy and Spain, vineyard after vineyard collapsed. By 1870, 70% of French wine production was gone. Not reduced, gone. Now picture one anonymous man in that collapse. He is not a famous chateau owner. He is a sharecropper outside Montpellier, and his family has pruned the same rows for 3 generations. He is standing in a row in late August, holding a cluster of grapes that never ripened, soft and sour and shrunken, and his hands are shaking because the landlord will come next week for rent that can only be paid in wine. And there is no wine. His children have been drinking the weak, second-press piquette all summer because there was not enough good wine to sell and also to drink. His wife has been stretching soup with water that he knows is not safe. The blight was nature, the fact that he had no other way to live, no other crop he was allowed to plant, no bank that would help him. That was policy and economics. Sit with that for a second if you want, because that one aphid and that one root rewrote the map of Europe. Entire regions emptied. Villages that had spoken only the language of the vine for 1,000 years were abandoned. French winemakers fled to Algeria and planted a whole new wine colony there. So much that by 1930, Algeria was the largest wine exporter on earth. An empire of wine built because a bug ate France. And the solution, when it came, was as strange as the problem. Scientists discovered that American wild grape roots were naturally resistant to Phylloxera. So they began to cut the tops off European vines and graft them onto American roots, sewing 2 plants together like a transplant. Almost every bottle of French wine you have ever drunk is a Frankenstein plant, a European head on an American body, joined at a scar you can still feel with your thumb if you dig down to the base of the vine. A handful of white crystals decided who ruled and who starved when we talked about salt. A bug the size of a dust speck and a graft scar thinner than a coin decided what wine even is today. We solved it, but only by admitting that the pure European vine we were so proud of could not survive alone. And after that scar, wine came back stranger and more powerful than before. If you think wine is just agriculture now, you are missing what it became while you were not looking. Here are the things you will want to tell someone tonight. First, your bottle of wine is full of living information that no other food carries in the same way. In 2012, scientists opened a bottle of 170-year-old champagne found in a shipwreck at the bottom of the Baltic Sea, perfectly preserved by the cold and dark, and they could still drink it. They did drink it. They described it as smoky and sweet and still faintly bubbly, because the yeast had been asleep for almost 2 centuries. One sip was a direct chemical message from people who lived before the light bulb. And in Georgia right now, families are still opening Qvevris that their grandmothers sealed 12 years earlier, tasting the same method those first innovators used. A living survivor of 8,000 years in a single jar. Second, wine quietly built modern science. Louis Pasteur did not study fermentation because he was curious about beer. He was hired by the French wine industry, desperate to stop wine from spoiling during transport. And in figuring out why wine turned sour, he discovered germs. Pasteurization, the process that keeps your milk safe, is named after a man who is trying to save wine. Your refrigerator and your vaccine both trace part of their history to a wine barrel. Third, and this is the industrial secret no label ever tells you, almost all wine today looks natural and old-fashioned, but is made with a level of control that borders on science fiction. A modern winery can dial the exact aroma of grapefruit or vanilla into a wine by choosing a specific lab-grown yeast strain. There are more than 200 commercial yeast strains you can order, like paint colors. They can remove alcohol without heat, so you can have 0% wine that tastes fermented. They can add powdered tannin, add acid, take acid away, and none of that has to be on the label. The most natural-seeming bottle may have had its flavor tuned in a lab more precisely than your phone screen. Legend says some of the most expensive Bordeaux chateaux still use egg whites to filter their wine, cracking hundreds of eggs a week. And reportedly, one famous estate in Burgundy still walks the cellar with a candle to look for the perfect moment to rack the wine by eye, a ritual no censor has quite replaced. And finally, the body part detail. The reason you can smell a wine and instantly get cherry or leather or butter is not because those things are in the wine. It is because your nose and brain share a language with fermentation. When yeast makes alcohol, it makes hundreds of other molecules as side effects, and many of those molecules are identical to the ones in cherries, in leather, in butter. You are not imagining it. Your olfactory bulb is actually detecting the same chemical. Wine smells like the world because the microbes that made it use the same small toolbox of scents that all living things use. So here we are, 8,000 years after a woman stained her hands purple and listened to a jar hiss. We started with a piece of fruit that had no intention of becoming anything but food for birds, and a fungus that had no intention of making anything but more fungus. We taught them to meet on our terms, buried the result in the earth, learned to keep it from becoming vinegar, argued for thousands of years about whether it made us divine or sinful, smuggled it across blockades, grafted its roots onto another continent to save it, and now we tune it like an instrument. And that woman is still there if you know where to look. In Georgia, a girl today is kneeling in cool earth next to a jar as tall as her waist, her hands stained purple up to the wrists, listening to it hiss. She is not making vinegar. She is making wine, the same way. If that hits you, choose your rabbit hole for the comments. I read them. Do you want the deep dive on the widow who gambled everything on one ship full of bubbles and invented the riddling rack so her wine would run clear? Or the horror of the vineyards that died in a single summer when the roots rotted and families were left with undrinkable piquette and unsafe water? Or the modern fraud where the same grape juice becomes 5 different wines because of a yeast you order from a catalog? Tell me which one you are picking and why. And if you learned something you did not know this morning, you know what to do.